So today I'll talk about security advisory. I believe all our customers knows that to improve customer experience, F5 is publishing vulnerability on quarterly basis since November 2021, if I'm not wrong, and call it quarterly security notification. Now, apart from moving to quarterly security notification, the language of the security advisory and the content has also been improved. So I think from there, I got this idea, okay, let's record some session and take help from Aubrey to record this session and explain how to digest the information available in the security advisory. So here I am with the session where I will go through all the section of the security advisory and explain the information available in each section. So let's get started and understand the format of security advisory first. So if we see the security advisory here, we have different sections here, starting from the title. Then you have original publication date, updated date, applies to, security advisory description. Then you have impact session. Then you have security advisory status. And down below you have recommended actions, mitigation, and acknowledgements. Okay, so let's go through each section one by one and understand what all information we can find from those sections. So very first the section is title. Okay, in the title you may see that from the title you find out this vulnerabilities is about what. Okay, so if you see here it says big IP message routing MQTT vulnerability, and CVE number is also given. So from here you can find out this vulnerability is about message routing MQTT in big IP. Right, and other things which I have mentioned, that CV number is also there in the title. If you want to find out in which year this vulnerability was published, so the digit, right, which is 2022, and this CV number that tells the year when this vulnerability was published. Okay, and if you want to find out the exact date of this vulnerability, like when exactly this vulnerability was published or the security advisory was published, you may see this information in the original publication date, which I have highlighted here, which is August 3rd, 2022 in this case. And in case you want to find out if this advisory was updated at any point of time, you may find that date information here in the updated date. Now, there is a small section here which says applies to, right? If you see, there is, so often, right, people get confused with this and mix this with the vulnerable version. They think, okay, the information which is under applies to are related to the version which are vulnerable and the products which are vulnerable, which is not true. Okay, so to get that information about whether which versions are vulnerable and which products are vulnerable, for that there is a table down below which I'll explain later. So yeah, you have to check all the information there. Now, as I mentioned, right, this applies to create some sort of confusion. So we are considering to change applies to a more self-explanatory title. Okay, so next is security advisory description. Okay, let's find out what all information we can find from security advisory description. So in general, right, you may find out the condition. Okay, what is the condition which makes big IP vulnerable here. Then you can find out what sort of like how attacker can exploit it, and what will happen once the vulnerability is exploited. So let's read this and find out how we can digest that information. So very first line says, when the message routing, message queuing telemetry transport profile is configured on a virtual server, which means the condition here is there is a virtual server and message routing MQTT profile is configured on that particular virtual server, which makes the big IP vulnerable. And how the attacker can exploit it, which it is mentioned in the next line, which says undisclosed request. So attacker can send some sort of requests here, which using which attacker can exploit the vulnerability. And to find out what will happen once the vulnerability is exploited, you can read the next line, which says it can cause increase in memory resource utilization. It means once the vulnerability is exploited, you will see the memory resources are really high. Okay, now let's go back to this undisclosed request, right? A question will come into your mind like, why F5 is not giving any sort of information here, right? No POC, no sample request, which can be used to exploit this vulnerability. Actually, this is intentional. Okay, reason being, if we provide the POC, right, or a sample request, that will do more harm than good to the customer. Okay, say for example, right, F5 there is a vulnerability which was published by F5 today. Okay, now it's close to impossible that as soon as F5 will publish the vulnerability, customers will upgrade their big IP, right? It will definitely take some time, and there is always a window which attacker can use here to exploit the vulnerability, because he can simply find the exploit here, right, in the security advisory. So that's the reason F5 do not provide the POC or the sample request which can be used to exploit this vulnerability. Okay, so I think this is clear. So let's move to the next section, which is impact section. Okay, so let's see what all information is available in the impact section. So here also you can find what's the exact impact, right, once the vulnerability is exploited, and then you can find out how attacker can exploit this vulnerability, right? Whether attacker needs any authentication or it doesn't need any authentication, whether attacker is remote or local. So that all that information also you can find from here. Then you can find the type of vulnerability. Okay. Then apart from that, you can also find out whether this vulnerability is exposed to both control plane, data plane, or only control plane or data plane. Okay. So let's read this again and see how we can digest the information. So very first line says system performance can degrade until TMM process is either forced to restart or manually restarted. Okay. So from here, we can find out that once the vulnerability is exploited, then the memory resource will go up and your system performance will degrade, right? Until your TMM process will crash because of the high memory utilization, or maybe you restart it manually. So that's the impact here. Now, to find out what attacker can do and how it can whether attacker needs any authentication or not. So let's read the next line. So here it says the vulnerability allows a remote unauthenticated attacker to cause a degradation of service, right? So the attacker here is remote, right? He can do this remotely. He doesn't have to be local to this big IP, right? And he doesn't need any sort of authentication, right? The attacker is unauthenticated attacker here. So this information we can find from here. And once the attacker will exploit the vulnerability, definitely you will see the degradation of service. Now to find out what sort of vulnerability, like what type of vulnerability is this, let's read the next line. It says it can lead to denial of service on big IP, right? So from here we can find out that this vulnerability is DOS type vulnerability. Okay. Now, the last thing is we need to find out whether this exposure is both on control plane, data plane, or only on a specific plane. So let's read the next line, which says there is no control plane exposure. This is data plane issue only, right? So from here you can find out, okay, this vulnerability can be exploited only from the data plane. No exposure on the control plane. Okay. So I think we are done with impact. So let's go to the next section, which is security advisory status. Okay. So here, very first thing you will find is the bug ID, which is assigned to this vulnerability. In this case, it's 1032513. Then you will find information on CWE. Okay. Now, I believe not many people knows about CWE. So let me give you a brief information on CWE. Okay, so CWE, or Common Weakness Enumeration, is a community developed list of common software and hardware weakness types that have security ramifications. Okay, now weakness can be of any type. It can be flaws, faults, bugs, or errors in the software or hardware implementation, maybe code design or architecture, which if not addressed, then it can lead to system, networks, or hardware being vulnerable to the attack. Okay. Now there is a long list of CWE and associated classification taxonomies. Okay, serve as a language that can be used to identify and describe these weaknesses in terms of CWEs. For example, okay, in this case the CWE is 404. Okay, Let me open this. So if you read the description here, right, it says the program does not release or incorrectly releases a resource before it is made available for reuse, right? So this is the description. From here, you can easily find out what sort of weaknesses there which causes this vulnerability. Okay, so yeah, I think we are. Let's move to the other parts of this section. Okay, so I think so far I talked about title, publication dates, applies to, description, impact, bug ID, and CWE. Now let's digest the information in this big table. Okay, let me move this. So this is the big table which we are going to discuss now. So this table will provide the information on products which are assessed against the vulnerability, vulnerable and not vulnerable software versions, severity, CVSS score, and the vulnerable component or feature, right? And one important thing to note here is that F5 evaluates only software versions that have not yet reached end of technical support. So you have to keep this in mind. Okay. Now, another thing which I would like to highlight here is that if you check the vulnerable version, right? Let's take the example of 16x branch, right? Here you will see the vulnerable versions are 16.10 to 16.12. Okay. And fixed version is 16.1.2.2. Now, a question will come into your mind like whether 16.1.2.1 is vulnerable or not vulnerable, right? So any version which is prior to this fixed version, which is in this case like 16.1.2.1, that will be vulnerable. But any version which will come after 16.1.2.2, for example 16.1.2.3, that version will not be vulnerable. So that version will have fix. So it means once the fix is introduced in a version, all new versions will the fix will be rolled over to the all new versions. Okay, so yeah, in this way you can understand like how the fixed version and vulnerable versions can be understood. Okay, now apart from this, we often get another question from customers where they mention like, what should I do if I'm running an older platform which is really not compatible with the fixed software versions? So in that case, right, very first thing you should do is if your hardware is under extended support or completely out of support, you should consider to upgrade to a fully supported hardware platform. Okay, reason being, F5 will not release engineering hotfix on maintenance or point releases that were current when a platform passed platform EUSD and entered extended support. Okay, however, a point to note here is for already running platform that is not fully supported, you may consider updating to a software release with the fixes. Okay, now important thing to note here is that F5 do not take steps to break updates for platform in extended support. So in general, F5 expects that later maintenance and point release or point releases issued after the platform entered extended support should work normally. Okay, let me take an example here to explain. Okay, so for example, like let's say like you have a hardware which is 800 series. Okay, now the maximum as per this, right, the maximum you can go is 14.1.2. Okay, now if you see this security advisory, it says the fix is in 14.1.5. Okay, so what I'm saying, like even if you go to 14.1.5, we expect that okay, the version will work normally. There won't be any problem. Okay, so I think this also was an important point which I wanted to share with everyone. Okay, so okay, so now let's move back to this table again. Okay, so you have like, okay, let's talk about product again. So under product, you will see all the products which are assessed. Okay, you can see like products mentioned are Big IP SPK, F5OS, SPIN Mesh, etc. Now you must have noticed that in front of Big IP, all modules are mentioned. Okay, so it means all Big IP modules, okay, are vulnerable here. Okay. In case a specific module is vulnerable, so that specific module will be mentioned here. Okay, but in this case, all modules are vulnerable. That's the reason it's mentioned like that. Okay, so let's move to vulnerable component and feature. Okay, so it tells the name of component which makes big AP vulnerable. In this case, vulnerable component is virtual server with MR MQTT profile, which means if the big IP has a configuration where MR MQTT profile is configured on a virtual server, okay, it is vulnerable. Whereas if there is no virtual server on big IP which is configured with MR MQTT profile, vulnerability cannot be exploited irrespective of the software version. But there is a catch here, right? Always keep in mind that maybe vulnerability cannot be exploited today because the vulnerable configuration is not there on the box. But there are high chances that in future to support some new application, you may need to do that configuration, and that time maybe you forget that okay, there is a vulnerability specific to this configuration. So it's always better or recommended to upgrade to a version which has fixed, okay, which has fixed for that particular vulnerability. Okay, now next let's go to severity and CVSS core. So severity, right, it actually comes from CVSS core. So let's open this and understand what all information you can understand from CVSS core. Okay, so from the CVSS core, right, you can find comparatively more information. Okay, so let's see. So from the CVSS core, you can find out whether the attacker, right, it can exploit this vulnerability from network, or it needs any local access or physical access to the box. Okay, you can also find out whether how complex is the attack, right, and if the attacker needs any sort of privilege, if privileges are required, then the attacker needs high privilege or low privilege. Okay, that information also you can find from here. And in case attacker needs user to perform any step so that attacker can exploit the vulnerability, that also you can find from here. And you can also find that if there is any scope change or not. So in case the vulnerability is exploited and it crosses the boundary of the vulnerable component, then scope will change. Apart from that, you can also find out what's the actual impact, whether the impact is on confidentiality, integrity, or availability. As you can see here, in this case, the impact is only on availability. Okay. Now, the severity, right, as I mentioned, it came from CVSS score. So in this case, it's high, and the score is 7.5. Okay. So these are the information you can find from CVSS score. Let's go back to the security advisory again. Okay, so I think I have covered everything in the table. Let's move to the next section. So next we have recommended action, mitigation, and acknowledgements. So recommended action, right? It's always recommended to upgrade to a version which has fix. Okay, that's the rule. If you have a version which has fix, so upgrade to that version. That's the recommendation. Under mitigation, you will find the steps to mitigate the vulnerability. Okay, and there are vulnerabilities which are discovered internally, and there are vulnerabilities which are reported by the external researchers. Right? In the acknowledgement section, you can find out whether the vulnerabilities was discovered internally by F5 or was reported by a researcher. So in case a vulnerability is reported by the researcher, F5 acknowledges that researcher by adding his details here under acknowledgement section. I think I have covered everything about security advisory, but before I end this session, I would like to highlight few important key articles here. One is K4602, this one, and another one is K122.01527. Okay, so in K4602, right, if you want to find out the security policy, F5 security policy, you may find the information here. If you want to find out how to report a vulnerability to F5, you may also find the information here. And you can also find information on vulnerability categories, security advisory, vulnerability disclosure policy. So all this information you can find in this particular K article. And in this article, right, it gives the information on quarterly security notification. For example, like when was the last time we published the vulnerabilities, and when will be the next time we are going to publish the vulnerability. So all the dates are mentioned here. So these are the two articles which I really wanted to share with you. before I end the session. I think with this, I have shared all the required information. I hope the session was informative. Yeah. Thank you.